Next, I'd like to introduce Tymofiy from Kyiv School of Economics, who's joining us here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just passing by. It was such a nice opportunity to be here. Thank you for the privilege. I was reading New York Times, which has written a, for me, very unfair, I guess, article about the fact that sanctions are not working, Ukraine is losing, and it's time to recognize reality and make hard choices. The article is actually, the title is Hard Lessons Require Hard Choices. I think the lesson really is that Russia can be stopped. That's lesson number one. And it appears that people have not learned that lesson, some politicians. And then the hard lessons is that politicians are afraid. They haven't gotten the courage to stand up to bully. And that's the lessons which have to be learned. Not to be afraid of Russia. Ukraine has been able to push back Russia in sea. The Black Sea Fleet has been pushed back. Now Ukraine is increasing successful missions against Air Force. Yes, Ukraine has lost Avdiivka, but it's 12 square miles, and Russia had to lose more people than it has lost, the Soviet Union lost during Afghanistan war. That's their only military advantage, complete disregard for human life. They can just throw bodies at the problem, and they literally do that. And so that's what the world is afraid of. They've played very well their nuclear rhetoric, that if Ukraine takes Kherson back, that's a red line. If Kharkiv offensive is successful, it's a red line. If there is an attack on Black Sea Fleet or Crimea, it's a red line. And every time they talk about nuclear retaliation, and every time we get delays in weapons because politicians are afraid. I was just at a conference at Harvard Kennedy, and there the moderator from DC, a prominent think tank, was very seriously talking that there is a real risk that if we support Russia, we support Ukraine in the fight against Russia, seriously, there is a nuke coming to DC. And another person on the panel, there were two of us, a European politician, got up in arms and saying, listen, this is just abandon the nuclear umbrella. The idea is, why, if we are afraid of Russian nukes, then we should just give up right now. So I think we're in a very difficult environment in which support for Ukraine indeed is dropping, and it will continue like that. This year will be very, very difficult. But I think people, I'm an economist, so I think in counterfactuals. What will happen eventually? People ask, how will the war end? What will happen eventually is Russia will move on to another country. So people here assume that somehow by default Russia is a peaceful country and we just need to come back to that status quo, the steady state. But if you look at the history of Russia in the last 30 years, the most normal state for Russia is to run an operation, to attack another country. Be it Moldova, be it Chechnya, okay, inside, be it Syria, Nagorno-Karabakh, Georgia. What will be the next country when Russia moves on from Ukraine? What is this country? My bet is on Georgia. So Georgia is next. Regardless of what happens in Ukraine, Georgia is next. So people are talking about Baltics, NATO. Well, yes, maybe. Currently, Russia is actively building infrastructure. Infrastructure for political polarization, disinformation, poisoning, for example. Those who follow know that people have been poisoned. Outside of Russia, in Europe, right, in Massa. People know that there has recently been a hit on a defector from Russia in Spain last week. a pilot, right? So Russia has an infrastructure to carry out clandestine aggressive operations today in Europe, and it's improving this operation. That's the national security threat for the US. It's not Ukraine per se which is at stake. It's the ability of Russia right now to build infrastructure for carrying out hybrid operations throughout Europe and corrupting political networks and corrupting the democracy by making voters emotionally polarized and abandoning the idea of informed choice. That's a real threat to democracy, and it's done in a hybrid way. So everyone is focused on whether Ukraine should be settling with Russia, and that's the discussion. And the discussion in New York Times was about, Zelensky faces a stark choice to continue to insist on getting territory back or give up some territory and build a prosperous Ukraine, a part of NATO and a part of EU. But the real trade-off is not that. The only way for us to get in the EU if there is security in Ukraine. The only way for us to get security, whether through NATO or not, is when the Western politicians get enough courage to stand up to Russia. And until that happens, there is no security for Europe, not just for Ukraine. So I think the real trade-off and the real problem is not in Ukraine, but in inability or somehow lack of strategic thinking among politicians or lack of courage and responsibility for the future. And while Russia building capabilities to undermine democracy in Europe and probably elsewhere, including the US, the politicians are debating whether it's time to settle and give up territories. It's not about territories. It's about the ability of Russia to influence and attack democracies, and has to be stopped. Politicians in the West have to understand that and get real. That's real politics. The real politics in Russia is a national security threat to all democracies. That's real politics. Real politics is not to give up part of Ukraine and hope that Russia will not continue to do what it has been doing for 30 years. Now, there is a bright spot in it. Russian economy runs on oil and gas. Sanctions, there is this discussion, sanctions are not working. The New York Times also has written that now oil revenues are higher than before the war. First of all, that's not factually true. They are on par. Second, they're comparing with the year which was COVID, with suppressed prices. And the third one is that they are not comparing the counterfactual that sanctions actually already deprived last year Russia from about 140 billion dollars on oil and gas. So sanctions are working. But if we're going to get serious about sanctions, that's just one tool. But even that tool can be strengthened. We can denote Russia as a terrorist state, we can isolate it and stop trading, we can actually prosecute people properly and not pretend. These 500 sanctions which have been imposed in response to Navalny, do they have a bite? Of course they won't, because the real sanctions are there and people are afraid to impose them. So, that's another problem. And so the New York Times takes this, and I think that's DC establishment, that's people that trying, they live in a fantasy world in which somehow world can go back prior the 21st of February 2022. It's not going to happen. Russia is there. It has built a machine. It's a threat to national security, and we have the instruments, the capabilities to deny its revenues. If we do deny the revenues, or if green transition finally happens, then Russia won't have the money to run these networks, because running these networks is expensive. So, I think each of us should work on bringing that day closer where Russia is denied of these capabilities. Because I think all democracies, not just Ukrainian democracies, are threatened. And it's unfortunately that people who talk real politics are in self-denial. Thank you.